everybody. Thank you for joining this session today. So this session very much focuses on a report that's recently been launched, the Global Maritime Trends 2050 report, which was produced by Lloyd's Register Foundation. We're a global safety charity, Lloyd's Register and the Economist Impact. While I drop everything, excuse me. So what this report does is paint a picture of 4 possible future scenarios that could play out over the next few decades, depending on the type of transition that may occur. Now, 2 of those scenarios are positive, based on a just gradual transition, which we've been hearing a lot about at COP, or a rapid tech-driven transition. However, 2 of them are rather bleaker. So one centres around a delayed transition, and the one we're going to be talking about today is focused on a regionalised and fragmented transition, where global sea levels will rise by at least 40 centimetres by 2050. Now, these scenarios are fictional, but they have been based on interviews with sector leaders around the world and following a literature review by the Economist Impact team. So what would this future look like for the maritime sector? Well, we'd see a seismic shift in shipping dynamics. As climate change intensifies, traditional shipping routes will face significant challenges, leading to more traffic in the Arctic Ocean using routes that have opened up due to melting ice. Even more extreme weather events and natural disasters will increase insurance costs for the industry, and many vital ports, such as Houston, Shanghai, and Lázaro, Cárdenas, may become completely unusable. On top of that, seafarers and maritime workers will face increasingly hazardous conditions, and we already know that they face some of those today. So this particular scenario is based on limited collaboration on climate action. It centres around staggered technology adoption, disrupted supply chains, and escalating coastal flooding. So what can we do about this? How can we prevent this potential future from unfolding? Well, our panel is going to give us their thoughts around this, so no pressure there. So I'd like to welcome our panellists today. So we have Ruth Boumphrey, Chief Executive of Lloyd's Register Foundation. We have Jeremy Anderson, who is Director of Just Transition and Sustainable Transport at the International Transport Workers Federation. We have Kenley Kenneth, Youth Negotiator, Republic of Palau, National Climate Change Office, and Elizabeth Petit, Head of Partnerships and Communications at the Sustainable Shipping Initiative. So welcome to you all. Thank you for joining us today. So I'm just going to put a couple of questions out to the whole panel to start with, and then we'll go to some individual questions. Global Maritime Trends 2050, this report highlights the scale of the decarbonisation challenge facing global shipping. What do each of you think about the barriers and opportunities when it comes to transitioning the world's fleet to zero-emission operations? Ruth, can I ask you first?
Thank you so much. Is this working? Okay, yeah, lovely, super. So thanks, Beth. I've got about sort of 4 areas that I just want to touch on for this, which are areas which in the foundation that we know something about and that we're driving forward, but I'm looking forward, of course, to hearing all the different perspectives across the panel. So one area, of course, is fuels. And I think we probably overly focus on the fuels, but there is still a lot of fuel technology, fuel advancement that needs to be done. And the common knowledge and sharing of fuel readiness is something that still needs to become part of our way of thinking and part of our shared mindset in the industry. I want to give an example there, actually, which I heard about yesterday from a colleague in Brazil who is trying to coordinate amongst Brazilian stakeholders preparation in the port system in Brazil for the transition. And she was saying that as she's going around and she is trying to get people to prepare for that future, a very complex future of transitioning the port system to new fuels. They are then saying, well, how we transition that will depend on what the shipping lines are planning to do. So we need to go and ask the shipping lines about what fuels they're going to be using. So they then go to the shipping lines, and the shipping lines that are basically global shipping lines mostly, and the people in Brazil don't have access to the kind of knowledge that's happening in the boardrooms about the direction of travel. So there's it's a chicken and egg situation I think we've heard about a lot here, about the ports can't make their investments until they know what the investments are in the shipping lines and vice versa. So there's that needs to be sort of commonly planned, and we need to have better sight of that. The second area is around efficiency, and ships last a long time. Big ships last a long time, and the things we build today will still be in service in 30 or 40 years' time, and the things we built 20 years ago will still be in service in 10, 20 years' time. So we have to look at the efficiency of what we've got out there right now as well. And that efficiency can be aided by digital skills, digital modelling, and just changes in practice and operations. Why are ships sort of racing to get to port and then spending 3 days, outside of a port, full engines on? These sort of practices need to change. Another area that I want to talk about is coordination. Again, in order to make all of these things happen, you have to have people leading the coordination effort and sort of banging heads together. I want to give a shout out for my colleague Catherine Palmer, who is the maritime high-level climate champion, who is sort of doing that work. And we've recently supported a second person into that team to lead the work across Africa as well. So there needs to be a huge degree of coordination to make things work. And then the sort of last area here is around the planning scenarios. So this work that Beth has been talking around is pushing out, trying to make boardrooms think, trying to make investors think, what does that future look like? And I think we need more shared planning scenarios as well. So that's my 2 pennies worth.
That's great. Thanks, Ruth. Jeremy, can we have your thoughts, please?
Thank you, Beth. And just for my first point, I'd like to pick up on what Ruth was saying about coordination. And maybe go a little bit stronger on that point. Because I find the discussion in the shipping industry about how we get to a faster transition quite surreal in a way, because you have a number of kind of players and corners in the industry that I think do essentially recognise the overwhelming case for action. But at the same time, when you actually come to the actions that are being introduced, particularly in the short term, they look a little bit tepid. And you often hear, well, we're holding back. You hear this from ship owners a lot. We're holding back on our next generation of orders because we're still not sure kind of what the right technological pathway is going to be, what the right ship class is going to be. And so I think this takes us at the moment, just thinking of the scenarios in the report, to like a slow, not particularly just transition, which is a big concern. And so there, you do get kind of a lot of talk about the need for stronger market signals, and there's this kind of slow rumbling conversation about market-based measure and carbon pricing. But I do wonder whether we want to be much more forthright about this in terms of thinking, what would it really take to have a more effective coordination right across the supply chain? As Ruth was saying, it's about fuels, it's about kind of the bunkering infrastructure, it's about building the vessels, and just bringing me on to my second point here. It's about kind of making sure that we properly invest in the workforce. So at the moment, with unfortunately the way things are going, despite some important initiatives that I think we will talk about later, things are going the wrong way with the workforce because we are losing many key experienced seafarers that after everything that they went through during the COVID crisis, the mental health challenges, being stuck on ships from month to end, the industry is now facing pretty severe labour shortages, precisely at the time when the industry needs to retain its seafarers to take on this enormous challenge that we have. So in terms of what are barriers and where kind of a course correction is needed, kind of rapid scaling up of the approach to the workforce. There's again a long-running conversation about kind of how we make the industry more supportive for women seafarers. That line is not budging very much at all at the moment. And of course, kind of how we kind of make this industry attractive for the generation of young seafarers that are entering the industry now or thinking about entering the industry now. And very pleased that we have a seafarer in the audience today from the Philippines, from our affiliated union AMASAP. And what really strikes me is that when you talk to young seafarers from the Philippines, they say things like, it used to be, we used to recruit seafarers in the Philippines, like see the world for free. That's no longer enough anymore. The industry needs to offer a lot more in terms of attractive careers.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Very insightful. Elizabeth, can I come to you next?
Yes, is this thing working? Perfect. So I think, for me, the IMO strategy, the updated IMO strategy from this year has essentially given us the trajectory of travel. We know what needs to be done. We know by when it needs to be done. We know it's going to be a multi-fuel future. So the question isn't really about what we're going to do anymore. It's about how. And we know what the barriers are. You'll have heard about it in a million different panels, in a million different conferences. It's the regulation. It's how to secure the supply. It's the offtake agreements for fuels. It's developing the training and technical standards. Now, I had a conversation just before COP with someone who was telling me that the events at this year's COP, the side events at this year's COP, seem a lot more specific and a lot more technical. And it was more difficult to sort of bring in very high-level speakers. And I thought, that's great. It means that we are getting to work, and it means that people are coming here to start to deal with the specifics of what it is that we need to do to meet the targets that the IMO has set, and hopefully to even exceed the targets that the IMO has set as well. I think the course correction point that you made in your metaphor, Beth, is great, because we're essentially laying down the road as we go. And this is, I think, a monumental opportunity for shipping to lay the foundations for a resilient shipping industry, a just and equitable shipping industry, an inclusive shipping industry. Something that I see we're starting to talk about a lot more, or at least in my work at the Sustainable Shipping Initiative, I've been saying this word a lot over the last few months, is co-benefits. And I heard it yesterday at a couple of events as well. How do we decarbonize in a way that has co-benefits for communities? How do we decarbonize in a way that has co-benefits for biodiversity? If you think about, for example, energy efficiency technologies and the potential positive impacts that they can have on underwater noise reduction. So it's fantastic to see that we're starting to look at not only decarbonization, but how decarbonization interlinks with pollution, how it interlinks with biodiversity, how it interlinks with communities and labor rights. So to me, that's a huge, huge positive step. And I'll leave it there for now.
That's great. Thank you. Kenley?
Thank you so much, Beth. To kind of give everyone in the room some context, the Shanghai Superport is 8 times the size of the Republic of Palau, my home island. So you can kind of see how, as a small island nation, like, what are your investments within shipping? What are your interests within shipping in itself? And like many other small island developing states, we're heavily dependent on imports. So when you talk about import and trade and you talk about shipping, you can talk about food security. You can talk about how it impacts culture. You can talk about how it impacts like the youth. So I'm very thankful for this space and this opportunity. So when you talk about opportunities and challenges within this sort of conversation topic, we can take into consideration, for example, Palau size. So although small in land mass, you take into consideration our exclusive economic zone, and we are the size of France. So you can kind of have a perspective of how we are known as the 8th continent, the blue continent, because you have all of these Pacific Island countries. I believe it's Pacific Island countries and territories, we're 23, which make up over 10 million square miles of the Pacific Ocean surface area. That's almost 10%. So how do we kind of involve the Pacific in not only the discussions, but also the implementation of like sustainable shipping, and in terms of like how we're shaping the narrative currently? As you said, we're laying down the roadmap. We're kind of going along and kind of seeing what fits well. It's going towards like a multi-fuel future, and we're kind of trying to see what fits best in order to address climate change as well. So I would say that the challenges are that we depend so much on imports, and unfortunately, the Pacific in itself is not very involved in decision-making process. So I really appreciate the space to kind of talk and kind of see how we can best integrate not only Pacific Islands, but SIDS in itself within these decision-making processes. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you all. Just to sort of to pick up a few of those points, I think a couple of you mentioned the need for cooperation, information sharing, and making sure that everybody's voice is heard, right, when it comes to making those decisions as we make that transition. Okay, so another question to all of you, which leads quite nicely off the back of some of those comments, is around the need for partnerships and collaboration. In the report, it mentions the need for partnerships between industry, governments, labour, civil society and technical organisations as being crucial mechanisms for advancing sustainable shipping solutions. So I'd like you all to comment on that if you can, and particularly in which way can cross-sectoral collaboration drive progress? Over to you, Ruth.
Thank you so much, Beth. I just want to say before we start out that I'm very optimistic about collaboration. I'm very optimistic about the maritime industry. I'm not from the maritime industry, and I sort of entered this world around 8 years ago, and I've been watching the kind of progress in dialogue that's been happening, and it was viewed as a sort of hard-to-abate, old-fashioned kind of sector. It probably still is viewed like that a bit. But what I've seen is a huge degree of cooperation, and then this sort of milestone at the IMO this year, and people really modernising their ideas and changing the way they're thinking. And so I'm very optimistic about it. Where do we still want to act, and how what changes can we make? So what I also observe is that the dialogue is very much driven by a sort of European and North American mindset, and that there needs to be a different way of looking, not different, but all voices are welcome, but actually we need to extend the opportunity and think about how to make the opportunity real in different parts of the world. So I'm just going to touch on two things that the foundation is very much interested in. And number one is, they're both partnerships actually with the United Nations UN Global Compact. Thank you, Beth. The United Nations Global Compact, which is the private sector arm of the United Nations. So it's the companies all around the world that are working towards the Sustainable Development Goals. So one program that we're initiating with them is around, we're calling them Ocean Stewardship Centres. And we're working in 7 different countries who have a huge potential to increase their ocean industries, including their maritime industries, and who have a desire to do so, but are not currently like at the centre of the planning system or the centre of the dialogue system. And so we're providing funds for what we call locally led dialogue and locally led transitions. And our hope is really that those countries, just to name those countries, the Brazil, Kenya, Ghana, Indonesia, Philippines, India and Bangladesh is where we're starting. And we're going to provide the sort of financial support for them in a way to coordinate between them, host their own table, not have to get invited to other people's table, host their own table, but also network into the wider networks of more maybe European and North American countries and some Asian countries as well, who have sort of strategic plans, as well. So to have that knowledge sharing happening across the world, and our foundation funding will just go to the places which are least able to fund themselves to do that. And the second area is around the just transition work, and I'm sure Jeremy will talk about this as well. So we've been the funder for, again, into the United Nations Global Compact for the just transition for seafarers. And our aim there is really, again, putting our money where people are less likely to have a voice themselves, and to enable that voice. All we have really is financial resources to help that. We can't speak for people; other people need to speak for themselves. But maybe by injecting some money into that system, we can make that change. So that's the sort of 2 areas that we're focusing on in the foundation. Jeremy.
Thanks, Ruth. That's a perfect segue to what I was going to say. So thank you. And I would say that when it comes to multi-stakeholder initiatives, and these partnerships, shipping can say that it is perhaps is leading the way because in terms of the body that Ruth just mentioned, the Maritime Just Transition Task Force, this is the first global tripartite body on just transition that has been established in any industry. So we established this at COP26 ourselves, along with the International Chamber of Shipping, the UN Global Compact, and also the IMO and the International Labour Organization. So not quite the full set of UN agencies, but three very good ones. And of course, we're very grateful to the support of Lloyd's Register Foundation. But this is kind of a very important initiative for us. I mean, speaking as someone that works across like a number of different transport sectors, I can say that when it comes to shipping, there is a much kind of deeper appreciation in the first instance from stakeholders of the importance of including the human element, which is why we are further ahead than other sectors. And I think we should keep it that way. We should keep pushing along. But just in terms of what that involves practically, so we established this at COP26. We came back last year at COP27 with a study of how many seafarers will need to be retrained in order to crew the low emission vessels in line with the Paris Agreement targets. And the other thing, just to give ourselves like a little bit of extra work and a few headaches after some pretty robust discussions, we came up with our 10-point action plan for a just transition for seafarers. So this is our recommendations for governments and industry about kind of what needs to happen to implement a just transition. And this touches on areas like training, like protecting kind of health and safety, how we really start to break the deadlock around gender segregation in the industry, and really importantly for us about kind of how we make sure that seafarers kind of are part of the everyday conversation when it comes to making this transition work on the ground. But we also kind of recognise that this is not just about kind of what happens within the shipping industry. It's also about linkages with other sectors as well. And I'm very pleased you're all here, that you skipped the other event on this thing that's happening right now, which is the Joint Transport and Energy Ministerial. And I think this is very important. We managed to get Transport Day and Energy Day lined up at COP this year so that this event could happen. Because it's really important that obviously shipping is very dependent on what happens in the energy sector, ourselves and other organisations are working on how do we really kind of get that going in terms of kickstarting the production of alternative fuels for shipping and also the bunkering infrastructure as well. I'll leave it there, but I think shipping is modelling good behaviour at the moment when it comes to inclusive partnerships that really put the human elements at the centre.
Thank you. Elizabeth?
Thanks. I'll pick up actually on what everyone's talked about, which is the just transition. And I wanted to, so SSI is a member of the, not the task force, but the peer learning group, the Just Transition Maritime Task Force peer learning group. Because the shipping industry, if there's one thing that the shipping industry is terrible at, is picking a name for something that has less than 5 words in it, which you're going to hear more about in a second. And, we do work on seafarers as well. We have work that we've done with the international, the Institute for Human Rights and Business, apologies, one of our members, as well as the Mission to Seafarers. We do, and the RAFTA Foundation, we do some work there on seafarers' rights. But another piece of work that we've started doing recently and that was actually published yesterday, so please allow me a second to tell you about this new publication, is a report that we've done with two organizations with very long names, the Merce McKinney-Muller Center for Zero Carbon Shipping and the UN Global Compact Ocean Stewardship Coalition, on the need for a just and equitable transition to be one of the considerations when you're building a green shipping corridor. So you'll, again, if you're tuned into the conversation happening in shipping at this COP, you'll hear a lot about green corridors. There's already been some announcements last week. And essentially what we're trying to do with that is particularly the Pacific Island nations within the shipping sector have done so much work to try to make sure that the transition for shipping, to try to make sure that the IMO strategy is just and equitable, that it's inclusive, that it's supporting the countries that need the support. And when we look at green shipping corridors today, the majority of them are in the global north. So one of the things that we're starting to ask questions about and try to encourage discussion on is how do we change that? How do we build green corridors that are just and equitable? How do we build green corridors that are sort of equally spread out around the world? And how do we make sure that that knowledge is being shared? How do we make sure that the learnings that we're getting from green corridors are being shared with everyone and are supporting the countries that need support? I also wanted to take the opportunity, since the question was about collaboration, to shout out a few of the other events that are happening at COP. Because when I came here, this is my first COP, and what I've heard a lot is that maritime used to not be very big on the agenda. But I'm here for 3 days, and the 3 days are absolutely jam-packed with shipping events. And they're all dealing with different areas of the shipping challenge, which I find incredibly interesting and incredibly inspiring, because it means that you have a chance to hear about so many issues that you wouldn't be hearing about otherwise. So I've written a couple of things down. There is a green hydrogen implementation lab taking place tomorrow. There's a number of national pavilion events that are focused on decarbonization of shipping at the national level and on green corridors that each sort of country is developing. Just later today, SSI and the Lloyd Register Foundation will host a side event on Africa's role in shipping's green transition at 3 o'clock. And that's going to be directly followed by an event co-hosted by BIMCO on ship recycling to take you to a completely different kind of sphere of the challenge. There's talks on wind power happening on the 11th. There's talks on ports and port resilience and the need for a just and equitable transition. There was a great event here yesterday about a new report from the LR Maritime Decarbonization Hub, the Environmental Defense Fund, and ARUP on, let me read it, Sustainable First Mover Initiatives. So essentially looking at what ports are best placed to deliver the co-benefits, and there's that word again, between local communities and also producing and bunkering alternative fuels for shipping. And this morning, there was an event that talked about green steel and how shipping can be a demand sector for green steel, actually. So once we're decarbonizing the fuel source, how do we start to decarbonize the vessel itself? So those are all massive examples of collaboration. None of those things are done by one organization alone. So I just wanted to share some of the things that I'm taking away from this COP and that I hope you will all go explore different events as well.
So when you talk about partnerships, what immediately comes into mind is that 2 days ago, we recently launched this initiative within the Pacific called the Unlocking Blue Prosperity Plan, the UBPP, which was committed $225 million. I think it was $100 million from the Bezos Foundation and then another $125 million from the Global Environment Facility. So when you talk about like partnerships in the Pacific and sort of establishing like how we can better manage our marine resources, how we can better plan for our marine spatial planning, I feel like that's so important because there's an interest in investment. It's just that within the Pacific in itself, there is no sort of technical experts. I wouldn't say none completely, but I would say that there are unfortunately very low numbers of experts within this area who can properly comment on the subject. In fact, before this panel, I had to call a few people and say, is the information I'm giving accurate? And it was quite hard to find. So I just want to say that with the intention that you know that considering the fact that our exclusive economic zones and we have a greater investment to the ocean that's aside from just the financial interest, it's our culture, it's our tradition, it's our livelihoods, and with increasing impacts of climate change in our area, unfortunately, more than just the superports are being impacted, we have our islands being impacted as well. And within the COP28 process in itself, I wish that ocean was a more officially recognized track and had its own sort of discussions in its place, because we can talk about maritime security, we can talk about shipping, we can talk about all these different elements that impact the ocean. But once we get to the financial nitty-gritty and the conversations within these areas and how the Pacific get involved, suddenly there's less of an interest within that area, within the experts. So I really once again, I'm thankful for this opportunity to not only highlight the challenges that we're facing, but also how valuable partnerships are, because we partner with governments such as Australia, we partner with bigger governments because they have the not just the resources, they have the financial means to support us in managing our own resources. So with that in mind, I'd just like to say that we do look forward to utilizing the COP as a way to establish more meaningful connections, hopefully with Lloyd's Register. I know a perfect person in the audience, actually, who's working with Palau's government in sort of managing shipping and all of those initiatives. And with that, I just say thank you so much. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Some great comments there from everybody. And as we've heard, there are a number of reports and initiatives, partnerships already out there, which is, shows us that there is progress being made. So I think there is reason to be optimistic, as you were saying, Ruth. Okay, so I'm just going to come to each of you individually now with a question. So Ruth, first question is for you. The report mentions the need for technology and infrastructure developments to enable the transition to zero emissions in shipping. What do you think are the key innovations that are required to make that happen?
Thank you so much, Beth. So I was very conscious about the title of this session about the ports going underwater, and that comes on to the topic of resilience. It comes on to adaptation. It comes on to thinking about how we build our infrastructure for that long term. I've already mentioned the ships that we build today. By the time those ships end their lives or get decommissioned, the population of the world will have completely changed. We'll have completely different population centres in the world. The knowledge and technology will be in completely different places in the world. So we really, these are long-term planning issues, which need to have people at the centre of them. So I'm very loath to talk about technologies, but I will. So. So there's a whole load of resilience technologies essentially needed around ports and infrastructure and coastal infrastructure, because as the sea level will rise, and that is where I feel pessimistic is in our ability to sort of head off the change. That the adaptation is certainly going to need a huge amount of investment, and we need new approaches to engineering, new approaches to building our ports, thinking about the waterways that we navigate. So, and then the second thing I wanted to raise, which you haven't raised so far, which is just thinking about what you said about Palau and about Palau being 1/20th the size of the port of Shanghai, which doesn't. But of course you're a seafaring nation, So when we talk about shipping, we're actually talking about a sort of a unit of boats, ships, which come under a certain regulation, which take most of the global trade, but they're not the largest number of boats on the sea. They're not the largest number of boats that need to be decarbonised. There's all sorts of service vessels and fleets and ferries and fishing boats. And, I sit on the board of a couple of companies that own one or two boats, and they're not ships, they're just boats. They go out and do research work. But we've been sitting there going, right, how are we going to fuel these things? Where are we going to get the fuel to change? So there's a lot of what I'd call sort of bottom up, lots of how are we going to make these changes in the wider maritime sector, in the wider ocean sector? And that needs to be brought into these technology transition pathways, needs to be brought into the discussions. Because at the end of the day, the number of ships on the sea, I think, are less than the number of trains on the Indian railways. It's like you can. This is a completely tangible and we can do it if we want to do it. We just have to put our minds to it. The other areas, I could talk about many of the things that Elizabeth talked about, sort of fleet modernization, circularity and ship design. I think that's a very important thing that we need to be building in. We need to be changing our engineering practices. We're teaching out engineering the same way we did 30, 40 years ago, and we need a whole load of new engineering practice and curriculum that goes alongside the transition process in general, and especially in shipping. There's a data sharing and efficiency and compliance sort of that we need to have if we're going to drive this. There are many sort of people in shipping who will only do it if they're told to do it, right? So, and we need to have that sort of open compliance, that sort of accountability that happens across the sector, and data, how it helps compliance, but also helps efficiency. But the big message that I want to end in what I say is about opportunity and where that opportunity is held in the world. So as I said at the top of my statements, the world will be a completely different shape, and the people of the world will be in completely different places, and the youth of the world will be in different places. And I especially in my heart is Africa, and if I look at the sort of population projections that are going to happen, what are going to be the opportunities for people in Africa to have an economic growth on the back of shipping? People in Africa will need goods and services, and they'll be providing and producing exports, especially fuel exports, into the global system. So without economic opportunity, it doesn't matter about the technology, it doesn't matter about everything else. The economic opportunity has to be at the centre of bringing people out of poverty, to give people proper choices in life, to make sure the offer from the industry isn't see the world for free. That's not a great offer. I mean, it works in some places, but the offer should be, you can have a good life by being in the shipping industry, that you can see your family, that you won't end up as indentured onto ships for 2 or 3 years at a time because of lack of choice. So it's the opportunity is what I want to end my comments with. Thanks, Beth.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Again, some really interesting comments. Firstly, around, it's not just about the size of the global shipping fleet, but also about all those other service vessels that are needed. And I love that about the opportunity. But yeah, we've got to make sure that anybody entering the industry is safe and looked after, both physically and with regards to their mental well-being. So Jeremy, over to you. So the question for you is around, obviously, the workforce, maritime workforce. So in your role, what do you think are needed when it comes to sort of skills development and initiatives that will enable that workforce to do what we need it to do?
So before I jump into that question, I also just wanted to reflect on a very interesting element of one of the report scenarios, which projected that there would be a swathe of industrial action by maritime workers in the 2020s, ultimately leading to kind of much better working conditions by the 2040s. And for those who know industrial relations in the maritime sector, that may seem unlikely at the moment. However, I think just on my kind of experience with the labour movement, it always seems unlikely until it happens. And I think in the wider context of where, let's face it, slow progress on climate action generally, relatively little resistance from below, if you like. I wouldn't be surprised if this is coming in ways that we don't expect. And seafarers, as we know, are very much on the front line of the climate crisis in terms of exposure, to increased stormy weather, to heat and heat stress, to being the ones that often have to go and rescue people when there's a crisis. So I just wanted to pick up on that kind of, I think, very important aspect of the report before diving into the question. Because, of course, we hope it doesn't come to this. We hope that we can actually can set things up in such a way that seafarers can be supported to really make the changes happen that are necessary. And going back to one of my favourite themes, which is the task force, and again supported by Lloyd's Register, we're just at COP, we've unveiled a new project that we're doing on a new training framework for seafarers we'll be working on low emissions vessels. And we've done this because although there is the kind of ongoing process in the IMO about revising the STCW, I hope I've got the acronym right, sometimes I mix up the order. I think we understand this is a longer term process that was going to take up to 10 years. And we need to start getting seafarers ready now. So that in terms of what this involves, it's going to involve a module that's going to familiarize all seafarers for like the changes on board, and then very particular training for officers and engineers as well. And this is what we see this as a crucial piece to get the workforce ready, so that when ship owners do start ordering their next generation of ships, that they can really move it along. But I just wanted to also, the other part of your question in terms of what good looks like for seafarers of the future. And so we know that a big thing around kind of working conditions on board is kind of access to communication, to stay in touch with families when you're at sea for 9 months on end with very little shore leave, or in some cases many months more if there's a crisis. And so some of the small but big things like that are really important. I've been talking about the importance of including the gender balance on board, but also I just wanted to comment on the geographic balance. I think there's been a really important conversation going on, led by the Pacific Island nations at the IMO, about climate justice in terms of a carbon tax on shipping, and where making sure that funds are available for adaptation in Pacific Islands and other low-lying countries. But I think another really important aspect of this is how do we support a Pacific Island seafaring workforce again? So I am from Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm very aware of the proud tradition of Pacific Island seafarers, in terms of how they navigated to these islands. But the global political economy as it is, the Pacific Island seafaring workforce has really essentially been whittled down. So as we talk about this new generation of vessels, I think we also need to talk about a new generation of seafarers in regions like the Pacific Islands. And then just fundamentally, I think that my last point here is that all of these things, we really need to recognize the role of seafarers as co-creators. All of these kind of micro actions that are happening by millions of seafarers around the world on a daily basis. So that means making sure that seafarers have the power to make their voices heard. They have their trade union rights, of course, and that they're fully embraced in terms of navigating us forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. It's while we want to make the industry more attractive to people, it's obviously acknowledged that there are significant challenges that seafarers are currently facing. So yes, absolutely, we need to manage that going forward. Elizabeth, I'm coming to you next. Looking ahead, what sort of further incentives, commitments, and cross-sectoral actions are needed? Looking specifically at multi-partnerships, multi-organizational partnerships.
So you've given me 2 questions on collaboration, which I'm going to take advantage of because we wouldn't exist without it. We are a multi-stakeholder initiative. We have 17 members across the shipping industry, and we just wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the willingness of those organizations to collaborate on finding solutions to different shipping challenges. So I'll take the chance to talk about collaboration a little bit more. I wanted to pick up on a couple of the points that both Ruth and Jeremy made. Jeremy, you're talking about starting to develop training frameworks. Ruth, you're talking about the support fleet, essentially. All of the vessels that we have that aren't these, gigantic container ships or bulk carriers or tankers. And I wanted to reflect on, as we head towards 2050, what we're talking about now in 2023 is testing. It's how do we get started? It's what are the frameworks that we need to develop. I picked up on your point, Ruth, because I was at an in-person member meeting that we had last week in Singapore, and one of the projects we're running right now is on green steel. And the discussion that we were having was, it's quite difficult to get ship owners interested in starting to buy green steel. First of all, there isn't a lot of green steel being produced yet, if any. So that's a challenge. But the other challenge is the amounts are massive. The amounts of steel that you need to build a vessel are massive. But if you start doing it for the smaller boats, or if you start doing it for repairs instead of new builds, that's an opportunity to test things out. That's an opportunity to see what can work, and to then scale that up. Similar with green corridors. Green corridors are looking to show what's possible in a specific case. I heard something at an event yesterday that I'll just steal and repeat now. I think it was Rob Kay from Arab who said, if you've seen one port, you've seen one port. So that means that each green corridor is going to be completely unique. Each green corridor is going to have a completely different set of circumstances, but they can all learn from each other. They're all going to have shared experiences that will be useful, even if the circumstances are different. So I think looking to 2050, what I'd like to see is I'd love to see where those conversations have evolved from where they are today, of thinking, how do we start to build those cases? How do we start to build the evidence? To an industry that has fully embedded those principles, that has fully learned from these pilots and these trials that we're running, and that is just, that is equitable, that is inclusive, that is resilient, that is all of the keywords that everyone's been using today. I also wanted to give a bit of a concrete example, again, going back to green steel, of the complexity of the landscape and the amount of things that need to change. If you think about, in 30 years, I'd love to see not only ships that run on zero-emission fuels, but ships that are built with zero-emission steel, ships that are fully decarbonized. But in order to do that, you need the ship owner as a customer, you need the shipbuilder as the actual kind of steel purchaser, you need the steel producer as the producer that's looking for demand of certain products. So things need to happen at every stage and for every stakeholder group. We're seeing ship owners switch to alternative fuels, which in turn means that ultimately the emissions from shipbuilding and the emissions from the material on board a vessel are going to become more significant as the emissions from the fuel combustion go down. So they have an incentive to start thinking about steel. We're seeing shipbuilding yards who are looking for a competitive advantage. So if you start offering, vessels with green steel, vessels with zero-emission steel, that'll give you a competitive advantage. Everyone needs a demand signal from their stakeholders to make this happen. Everyone needs a demand signal to start investing, and we've heard this a lot at COP. And so what I want to close on is just, this is what systemic transformation means. It means that we can't just knock down one domino. That's not gonna get us to 2050, and that's not gonna get us on a 1.5 aligned track. We need to knock out a lot of different dominoes to get the sort of chain reaction that we need to achieve these goals. And that's where collaboration comes in, and that's where we all need to work together, not just within shipping, but with all the other sectors that are decarbonizing as well that we work with. So shipbuilding, ports, steel. We're all, it's a cliche, but we're all in this together. And we do need each other to get there. Thanks, Beth.
That's great, thank you. I think that paints a very clear picture of what collaboration needs to happen and what good looks like. So Ken, the final question is to you. Thinking about the sort of increasing climate change impacts on coastal communities, what message do you have on the importance and urgency of a zero-carbon maritime transition?
Well, I would just like to go ahead and reiterate Ruth's point earlier about how the shipping industry is rapidly changing. and note that the same places that we're shipping to and shipping through are not going to be the same places we're doing the same exact activities in within the next 10 to 15 years. So for example, take into consideration the Pacific Islands like Tuvalu and the Marshall Islands. Within the year 2035, within the year 2030 and beyond, their islands are projected to be uninhabitable. So those shipping areas and those places that would require certain amounts of shipping are not going to exist within those times. So how are we accommodating and planning for that? Like, what is the policy and the framework in place in order to sort of address how the Pacific is rapidly changing in the face of climate change? The second point I want to make is that I want to just tell a little bit of a story. During COVID-19, we had very little shipping, like trade, like we had very little imports coming in. So I would see aunties fighting at the grocery section for fruits and vegetables coming in. So you can kind of get that as a perspective to know just how important imports are in like not only my island, but in other Pacific nations. And in order to kind of like address like a disaster management plan or sort of like framework in place, like this means showing up at these IMO meetings. This means like raising our voices and raising the flag and saying, hey, just letting you know that within the next 15 years, we know that the Pacific is going to rapidly change, just like the shipping industry is going to be changing. And I just want to wrap up with a final note that the Pacific depends heavily on shipping, and currently shipping depends heavily on fossil fuels. So it's like this vicious cycle, like this really horrible love triangle between like all of these stakeholders that are eager for change, but we kind of don't know how to implement those changes within the next 10 years. Hopefully there'd be a breakthrough by the end of this COP or maybe by COP 35. You know, we're optimistic and we're hopeful for what the changes they're going to bring. But on that note, I just want to say that the conversations I've heard today sound very promising. Like, you're quite right. We're literally on the same ship, shipping, because we're talking about shipping. And we kind of need to see how sustainable the planning is, not only within the shipping industry, but especially in the face of climate change. And the last note I want to leave you guys on is, not only do we need to save our superports, we need to save the islands that depend heavily on these shipping sort of stakeholders. Like, where are we going to be shipping to within the next 15 years? That's an important note. So thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
I just want to jump in and say I love that on the platform at COP we're using the word horrible love triangle. if it was, we should try and get that into every single conversation. I just wanted to pick up though on something Jeremy said. You were talking about trade unions and about union withholding labour. It reminds me that about 10 years ago there was a strike on the west coast of the USA. I think it lasted a couple of months, stopped imports into the west coast of the USA. It wiped 4% off the annual GDP of the USA, that one strike. So I think it's a very interesting concept of withholding labour in the shipping industry. It would be, closing the Panama Canal, the missiles which are hitting ships at the moment in the Red Sea. These are massive resilience issues that we need to be thinking about, and labour really does need to be at the heart of the transition because of that as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So I just want to wrap up by inviting you all after this session, if you want to talk to any of the panellists, obviously about the things they've spoken about, but also to talk to the foundation with regards to what comes next. So this report that we've talked about today is only the first step in a multi-year programme of activity. What we would like to do is commission a series of further reports, so we really drill down into some of the challenges and the topics that have been raised in this report, gathering really robust data, far more evidence, so we can really see what's coming and help the industry prepare more effectively going forward. So please do reach out. You can either do it through our website for those watching online, or just come and talk to us after this event. We'd really, really welcome your thoughts on what you think those topics should be, and hopefully we'll hear from you later. So that's it today from us. Thank you to all the panellists. Thank you so much for all joining today. It's been a really interesting conversation. And thanks to you all for coming. Thank you very much.